Hi, I'm Phil Hartwell, and this is my 70th video discussing British science fiction publishing and its writers. In my previous videos, I set out to cover the history of British publishers of science fiction during the post-war decade, the Mushroom period, and the writers who rose to prominence during it. This was the period I myself grew up in and discovered science fiction. As I said in my very first video, in 1954, I set myself the target of discovering exactly how the chaotic and mysterious situation in the UK of good science fiction being published alongside bad science fiction, often under the same byline. How had this arisen, and why had all these books disappeared by 1956? In this endeavour, I was pretty much a pioneer and working single-handed, and it took me several decades. My findings have been published in several books and magazine articles over the years. It's an early magazine article. About the 50s. A book on the life and work of E.C. Tubb. Article on John Russell Fearn in the Bookseller magazine. Talked about some of these books in earlier videos, especially Creature from the Black Lagoon. This is extensive bibliography. Another Bookseller article was about Ted Tubb. You see here. And we've discussed many of these books, especially that one, in earlier videos. That was a huge book, 130,000 words, which revealed all my findings. A lot of the videos were based on chapters in this book. Some of you may remember the feature about the British Tarzans. You will see that. So lots of books and magazines, culminating in my long series of videos which set out all the true facts. I also have some new books and articles in development which will form there's another magazine article on Dennis Hughes. Remember, I did a couple of videos about Dennis Hughes. There, everything was set out and discussed. And at the moment, I've commenced a series of articles. That's the first one. There'll be about 6 of them coming in Spaceship Away. This is the current issue. So my initial mission has now been largely accomplished, and this is why I've not posted a new video in several months. Now, one or two respondents have suggested that I might consider extending my survey and analysis beyond 1956, but apart from a few videos touching on the legacies and reprinting and filming of longer-lived vintage authors such as Ted Tubb, I've chosen not to do so. The internet is already awash with myriad booktubers, some of them brilliant and knowledgeable, some of them shallow and frankly inane. There are lots of others who commendably extol the undoubted merits of many British authors. We'll take a look at some of these here. These are some of the best British authors who are regularly featured by YouTubers. There's Brian Aldiss, John Brunner, Arthur C. Clarke, John Christopher, Michael Moorcock, Eric Frank Russell, Bob Shaw, classic writer Olaf Stapleton, and preeminently John Wyndham. Now, since I've read and collected and indeed met and knew many of these writers, I could very easily do the same sort of video myself. But this would only be retreading ground already well ploughed and explored by others. Similarly with American science fiction, which we'll take a look at next. In 1954, I also discovered American books and magazines and the writers. And in fact, I also then set out to research and discover everything about American science fiction as well. I have a huge collection of American books and magazines going back to the 1920s. Here we see 3 1928 issues of Amazing, Frank R. Paul cover there, illustrating the classic serial The Skylark of Space by E.E. Smith, with iconic Paul illustrations. That was the opening installment. And then we had the second installment of The Skylark of Space. Again, still illustrated by Paul. It's another iconic illustration. And this is the third and concluding installment of The Skylark of Space. Now, The Skylark of Space gave science fiction the key to the stars. It was the first epic set in interstellar space as opposed to interplanetary space. Very important historically. Here we see a classic magazine of the 1930s with a beautiful Leo Morey cover. And there we see one of his typical illustrations from the 1930s. This one first. And here's a classic issue of Starling stories from the 1940s. Earl Berger cover. And superb illustrations by the great Virgil Finlay, who was at his peak in the 1940s, illustrating for the science fiction magazines. One more. Virgil Finlay. My collection of American magazines includes every issue in which John Russell Fearn's many stories first appeared, as well as countless issues in between. Over the years, I discovered everything I wanted to know about the great and not so great American writers. Two of the greatest were Edmund Hamilton and his wife Lee Brackett. I had the pleasure of meeting these two fine authors when they autographed two books for me. We'll just take a look first at this issue of Starling, which featured a classic novel by Edmund Hamilton, and also featured a classic novelette by his wife, Lee Brackett. Here's the book that Lee Brackett autographed for me when I met her and her husband. Now, Edmund Hamilton, when he saw my copy of the of Battle for the Stars, when he saw that book, he objected to it describing him as one of the grand old men of sci-fi. Striking it through, he wrote inside, see there, he wrote, Edmund Hamilton, who was a middling good, middle-aged SF writer and not a grand old man. Now I also have, so here, I also have lots of magazines and books with stories by the likes of Robert E. Heinlein, Robert E. Howard, Henry Kuttner, Murray Leinster, H.P. Lovecraft, you see there, Richard Matheson, and Catherine Elmore, C. Elmore. Now this issue is a French reprint of Moore's classic debut story, Chamblot. And what makes it special is it's illustrated by Jean-Claude Forest, who went on to become the creator of Barbarella. Profusely illustrated by a famous French artist, the creator of Barbarella. Very famous story by C. Elmore. This unique magazine was gifted to me 45 years ago by Forry Ackerman. Now, see more classic American authors: Clifford Simak, Theodore Sturgeon, A. Van Voort, Stanley G. Weinbaum. Now this is the first appearance of Stanley G. Weinbaum in the magazines, with his well-known classic story, A Martian Odyssey, illustrated by Frank R. Paul. We see it here in the July 1934 Wonder Stories. And finally, another American great was Jack Williamson, whom I met at the Worldcon in Germany in 1970. And there were many others. I've also met and corresponded with and worked professionally with Forry Ackerman, Sam Moskowitz and Donald Walheim, whom I first met at Oxford in 1969 when he signed this book for me. Now here again, the internet is already awash with booktubers reveling in the reflected glory of all those iconic American writers and editors. In short, if I were to continue my videos, I feel it would need to be in an area that has so far been largely unexplored. Now recently, I felt amusing on the interesting fact that many science fiction writers I've collected also wrote extensively in other genres, such as westerns, and more notably perhaps in mystery and detective fiction, often under pseudonyms. In point of fact, the appeal of science fiction is that it has absorbed many of the tropes of detective and other genre fiction. Many of the earliest science fiction stories featured scientists as detectives, such as Arthur B. Reeves' famous Craig Kennedy series, which ran for more than 20 years, beginning in 1910. Kennedy spawned many imitators. One of the most colourful and bizarre was Frank Belknap Long's botanical detective John Carstairs, who featured in 8 stories and Thrilling Wonder Stories and Starling between 1941 and 1945, 6 of which were collected here as John Carstairs Space Detective in 1949. This is the 1950 British edition with an early Ron Embleton cover. Now, many of the classic science fiction stories owe their appeal to their borrowing of detective fiction tropes. Such a famous novel as The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester, for example, is essentially an inverted detective mystery, wherein the reader knows the identity of the murderer from the beginning as we see the planning and execution of each crime. The reader then enjoys seeing how the police try to solve the murder, or wondering if in fact they ever will. Bester's masterpiece thereafter works on several levels. Even after the murderer is eventually identified by the police, there is uncertainty as to whether or not he will get away with it. There's also a central mystery element. Who is the man with no face, a recurring character in the nightmare dreams of the murderer? In a tour de force ending, Bester skillfully ties up all the strands of mystery, and his final revelation is a classic of detective fiction. A clue that was right under the reader's nose from the very outset, yet because of the author's skill, 99% of readers will have missed seeing it. Now, the blurb of this 1954 British First Edition verifies my summation. The story had earlier been serialized in Galaxy magazine in 1952, and the following year, Galaxy followed this up with another famous science fiction detective novel, Isaac Asimov's The Caves of Steel, introducing the robot detective R. Daniel. Because of this merging of genres, it should come as no surprise that so many science fiction writers should also have been very successful writers of detective fiction. The two genres are highly compatible with each other. Other famous American science fiction writers who wrote detective fiction include the likes of Lee Brackett, Frederick Brown, Cyril Kornbluth, Henry Kuttner, Jack Vance, and Richard A. Lupoff. Now, Lupoff asked me to edit and abridge his detective novels for British publication, and I was able to get his famous series of Lindsay and Plum detective novels all printed in these attractive British editions. There's an entire series. It was a joy to work with Dick Lupoff, and I was able to get his entire series published in England. Now the question is, would followers of my science fiction videos be interested in learning about detective fiction or even westerns written by British science fiction writers? Well, as Harry Hill would say, there's only one way to find out, so stay tuned.